The silence was the mission objective. It was the entire strategic purpose of the cabin. The grueling 4-hour drive from the city, and the deliberate, disciplined withdrawal from a world that operated at a constant shout. After a 35-year career, silence had ceased to be a mere absence of noise. It had become a substantive, healing presence. It was the only therapy that had ever worked. The cabin was my sanctuary, a fortress of solitude constructed from dark, sturdy logs that had long ago surrendered to the landscape, embedded within a thick battalion of pine and birch on the shores of Whisperwind Lake. It was the sole impulsive decision of a meticulously planned life, a choice made from the sterile confines of a hospital bed, adrift in a sea of morphine, facing a future that had abruptly become a terrifying, unstructured void. My life here was governed by a new set of rhythms, the arc of the sun, the mournful cry of the loons, the whisper of the wind through the pines. The ingrained habit of rising at 0500 remained, a permanent piece of my internal architecture. But now, it was to watch the mist perform its slow retreat from the lake's surface. A steaming mug of black coffee, a familiar comfort in my hands. I would spend hours on the small, weathered dock, casting a line into the water, the objective not being to catch fish, but to engage in the meditative repetition of the act itself. It was a way to overwrite the tinnitus, to quiet the cacophony of ghosts that still echoed in the chambers of my memory. I was engaged in the slow, painstaking process of learning how to stand down. This fragile, hard-won peace was decisively breached on a bright Tuesday morning in July. I was on my porch, disassembling my grandfather's old fly fishing reel for a cleaning, a task demanding the kind of meticulous focus that kept my mind occupied. The sharp crunch of gravel on the access path was an alien sound, an acoustic intrusion on the natural symphony. I looked up, my body tensing instinctively, to see a woman marching towards my cabin with the unyielding purpose of a division commander heading to the front. She was in her late 40s, attired in expensive, immaculate athletic wear. Her blonde hair was slicked back into a ponytail of such severity it seemed to pull the skin taut across her face, creating a default expression of stern disapproval. She wielded her smartphone with the assurance of a field marshal holding his baton. "Are you the owner of this place?" she demanded, her voice as sharp and clean as a sniper's report. She imbued the word place with a palpable sense of disgust. I deliberately placed a minuscule gear from the reel onto a clean cloth, my movement slow and controlled to mask the sudden spike in my heart rate. "I am," I replied, my voice raspy from a morning of disuse. "Arthur Vance, and you might be—" "Carol Brewster," she declared, the name delivered as if it were a title. "I am the president of the Whisperwind Lake Property Owners Association. I've been fielding numerous complaints." My eyes scanned the silent, encircling woods. My nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the shoreline, completely obscured by a dense screen of trees. Complaints from whom the chipmunks have unionized. My attempt at disarming humor impacted her like a dud round, her lips compressed into a bloodless line. "From concerned residents who value the integrity of our community, your property is in gross violation of our bylaws. Just look at this mess." Her arm swept in a dramatic arc, encompassing the pristine forest that surrounded my cabin. The undergrowth is a chaotic jungle. The deadfall is a fire hazard. It is an aesthetic blight on the otherwise pristine visual harmony of Whisperwind Lake. I followed her gesture, my gaze falling on the lush ferns, the moss-carpeted logs, the wild tangle of blueberry bushes that provided sustenance for the local fauna. "Ma'am, that's called a forest," I said, my voice flat and devoid of inflection. "It's the primary reason a person seeks out a cabin in the woods. I am intentionally managing it as a natural, low-impact habitat." "It's a disgrace," she snapped, her certitude absolute. "The bylaws, which you were provided and legally agreed to upon closing, are unequivocally clear. Section 12, subsection C, mandates that all properties be maintained in a neat and orderly fashion. That implies lawns, Mrs. Vance, not unkempt wilderness. We have a standard to uphold." Her tone was a depressingly familiar one. It was the unwavering self-righteousness of the petty autocrat, the absolute conviction that their microscopic fiefdom was the center of the universe. I had encountered it in provincial governors, in local warlords, in second lieutenants drunk on their first taste of authority. To see it now, clad in designer sportswear and fulminating about foliage, was profoundly surreal. "Mrs. Brewster," I began, consciously modulating my voice to a calm, de-escalating frequency. "My understanding of the documentation is that this property, due to its long-standing existence prior to the formation of the association, is grandfathered and therefore exempt from the more recent, purely cosmetic bylaws." "Exemptions are a privilege, not a right," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into slits. "And privileges can be revoked by the board when a property becomes a clear and present nuisance to the community." A rustle in the undergrowth behind her announced the arrival of a boy of about 10, who I presumed to be her son. He prodded at a rotting log with a stick, his face a mask of profound boredom. "Mom, this is lame. Can we go?" "In a moment." "Kevin," she shot back, her laser-like focus remaining on me. "This gentleman needs to be brought up to speed on how we do things here." Her gaze shifted to my dock, where my old, forest green canoe was overturned. "And that is another violation. That color, all watercraft, as stipulated in Appendix B, are to be white, navy blue, or a muted earth tone beige. That green is garish." I stared at her, a slow, hot current of anger beginning to breach my carefully constructed defenses. We had moved from the merely tyrannical to the breathtakingly absurd. "You are telling me that the color of my 60-year-old canoe is a violation of your rules?" "It is, and a formal written warning will be issued, to be followed by a daily fine of $50 until all of these infractions are rectified. You will clear the underbrush. You will remove the deadfall. You will repaint the canoe. We expect full compliance within 14 days. She raised her phone and took a photo of my canoe. The sharp click of the shutter, an act of aggression in the tranquil air. "Mom." The boy whined again, his voice cracking with impatience. "We are leaving," she declared. She favored me with one final glare, a look of such profound contempt, it was almost a physical blow. This was a beautiful, exclusive, and harmonious community before you arrived. Mr. Vance, I assure you, I will not allow you to ruin it. She pivoted with a crisp, military-like turn and marched back up the path, her son stumbling to keep up. I stood and watched them go, the silence that descended in their wake now feeling different, heavier. It was a tainted silence. The perimeter had been breached. I reached down to retrieve the tiny, intricate gear from the reel, but my hand was no longer steady. A familiar, unwelcome tension was coiling in the pit of my stomach, the phantom limb of a lifetime of conflict beginning to ache. I had come to this place to escape the war, but it seemed the war, in its most mundane and infuriating form, had just followed me home. The first official salvo in what I was now calling Operation Whisperwind arrived, as promised, via certified mail. The heavy, cream-colored envelope, embossed with the Whisperwind Lake Property Owners Association's pretentious logo, felt heavier than its physical weight. Inside, on expensive letterhead, my alleged crimes were enumerated with the obsessive detail of a fanatic. Violation 1. Unmanaged Natural Growth Bylaw 12(c) was accompanied by a grainy telephoto picture of my shoreline, with my property circled in an aggressive red marker, described as a severe aesthetic blight and a harbor for vermin. Violation 2. Unapproved Watercraft Coloration, Appendix B, featured a close-up of my forest green canoe, which was labeled a jarring and non-harmonious visual element. Violation 3. General lack of manicured tidiness was a vague catch-all charge, citing unraked pine needles and visible moss as proof of my subversive agenda against community order. The document concluded with a demand for my immediate capitulation and the threat of a cumulative fine of $150 per day, commencing in 14 days. It was a declaration of total war. My training, my very nature, dictated a response based not on emotion, but on intelligence and procedure. I spent a long afternoon in my cabin's small office, conducting a thorough analysis of the legal terrain. I dissected the mountain of documents from the property sale, and there it was, in the original POA Covenants, Article 3, Section 4. It was a clear, unambiguous clause, grandfathering any pre-existing property from all cosmetic bylaws enacted after 1995. My cabin, my woods, my canoe, they were all legally untouchable. Armed with this factual intelligence, I drafted a formal, dispassionate letter to the association. I cited the specific article and section, attached a notarized copy of the original deed, and stated my legal position with clarity and precision. I sent it via registered mail, ensuring a documented chain of custody. A reasonable person, I believed, would be forced to concede. This belief was founded on a critical intelligence failure. I had assumed my adversary was a reasonable person. Her response was not a letter, but an invoice. 2 weeks later, a bill for $2,100 arrived. My detailed legal rebuttal was completely ignored, as if it had been vaporized upon receipt. She was not engaging in a legal dispute. She was attempting to overwhelm my position through sheer brute force. I called her. Mrs. Brewster, Arthur Vance. I'm calling about this invoice. Did you not receive my letter regarding my property's exempt status? I received your letter, Mr. Vance, she replied, her voice slick with condescension. The board and I reviewed your claim. We have determined that the grandfather clause implies a certain level of good faith effort to adhere to the community's evolving standards. Your deliberate cultivation of a primitive, unkempt state constitutes a nuisance, which, in our view, nullifies the exemption. The fines stand. The board, I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Who, exactly, constitutes this board? Myself, my husband Richard, and Gary Peterson from Lot 12, she said. We held a vote. Your appeal was denied. Pay the fine. Mr. Vance. She hung up. It was a show trial, a 3-person dictatorship. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a tightening in my chest. The stress began to manifest in familiar, unwelcome ways. Sleep became a series of short, interrupted patrols. The hypervigilance I had spent years trying to dismantle was reassembling itself, piece by piece. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, was a potential threat to be assessed. I discussed it with my wife, Sarah, that night. Her voice, even over the phone, was my anchor to sanity. This is insane. Art, she said. She's just making up the rules as she goes along. You can't let her get away with it. I know, I sighed. But a direct legal confrontation would be a long, ugly war of attrition. It's what she wants. She wants to drag me into the mud. So what do you do? For now, I said, a bitter taste in my mouth. A tactical concession. A meaningless gesture to demonstrate a willingness to comply. However absurd the demand, it's a de-escalation tactic. The following Saturday, I bought a can of beige marine paint, an officially sanctioned, harmonious color, and I repainted my canoe. It felt like a violation, like whitewashing a piece of history. Each brushstroke felt like a small defeat. When it was done, a bland, soulless vessel sat where a classic canoe had once been. I took a photo and emailed it to the association. Violation 2 has been rectified. I received no reply. The next invoice, however, arrived on schedule. It still included the daily fine for the canoe. At the bottom, a handwritten note. While the color is now compliant, the vessel itself remains in a state of disrepair. Scratches on gunnel, worn seat, and is therefore still in violation of general tidiness standards. That was the moment the mission objective changed. De-escalation was no longer a viable strategy. My adversary was not interested in compliance. She was interested in my unconditional surrender. This was not a negotiation. It was a siege. And as I stood there, the absurd invoice in my hand, I could feel the tectonic plates of my personality shifting. The quiet retiree was receding. The man who had planned campaigns, who understood the cold calculus of psychological warfare, was assuming command. The objective was no longer to seek peace. It was to achieve victory. The conflict bled from paper into the physical world. A predictable escalation from bureaucratic threats to tangible acts of sabotage. Each was designed to be deniable, to create a sense of unease and vulnerability, to make me feel unsafe in my own sanctuary. The initial probe was subtle. I kept a small, waterproof tackle box on my dock. One morning, I found its contents in a chaotic tangle, my best fishing line a hopeless snarl. It was a minor act, but a clear message. Your perimeter is not secure. I filed a detailed report in my Operation Whisperwind log, and then deployed a countermeasure, a compact, military-grade trail camera, discreetly mounted in a pine tree overlooking my dock. Surveillance was now active. A few days later, a healthy birch tree was felled across my only access road. It took me a full day with a chainsaw to clear it. As I worked, Carol and her husband glided past in their pontoon boat, watching me with undisguised satisfaction. The message was clearer. We can isolate you. I added photos of the suspiciously clean cut on the tree trunk to my log. The psychological toll was mounting. The cabin, my fortress of solitude, was beginning to feel like an exposed position. My phone calls with Sarah became a lifeline. You sound different. Art? She said one evening, her voice sharp with concern. You sound like you did when you were in the field. Tense. Distant. She sent her kid to destroy my garden. Sarah, I confessed, the words tasting like poison. The trail camera had captured a small, hooded figure stomping my tomato plants into pulp. A figure I recognized as Carol's son, Kevin. She's using her own child as a weapon. What kind of person does that? A sick one, Sarah said, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. This has gone too far. You have to call the sheriff. And say would accuse a 10-year-old boy based on a grainy night vision photo, I'd be painted as the villain, a predator harassing a child. It's exactly what she wants. No, this isn't evidence for the police. This is intelligence. It's leverage, to be deployed at the decisive moment. The decisive moment, Sarah repeated quietly. Listen to yourself. Art, you're talking like a general. I'm worried you're letting this woman drag you back into the very world we fought so hard for you to leave. It's the only way I know how to fight, I said, the admission costing me something. And right now, I'm in a fight. To understand my adversary more deeply, I needed to understand her motivations. I spent an evening conducting open-source intelligence research, digging into old local news archives and business journals. The picture that emerged was tragically clear. Carol Brewster had been a high-flying marketing executive, a vice president at a major corporation, known for her aggressive, take-no-prisoner style. 5 years ago, after a brutal corporate restructuring, she had been unceremoniously forced out. Her career, the central pillar of her identity, had been shattered. Whisperwind Lake wasn't a retirement community for her. It was a kingdom in exile, and the POA was her new boardroom. Her obsessive need for control wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a desperate attempt to rebuild the power and status she had lost. I was not just a non-compliant resident. I was a symbol of the insubordination that had cost her everything. This intelligence was confirmed by a new scene I witnessed. A few days later, I was observing the community from a concealed position in the woods when I saw Carol with her husband, Richard, on their deck. He was a quiet, weary-looking man who seemed to have been worn smooth by the constant friction of her personality. "It's just a dock, Carol," he was saying, his voice placating. "Is it really worth all this?" "It's not about the dock, Richard. It's about the principle," she shot back, her voice tight with a familiar, bitter fury. "It's exactly like at the firm. The disrespect, the assumption that the rules don't apply to him. I built that department from nothing, and they gave it to a smiling, incompetent millennial. I will not be pushed aside and made irrelevant again. Not in my own home." There it was, the exposed nerve. Her fight with me was a proxy war against the ghosts of her past. She wasn't just trying to enforce a bylaw. She was trying to reclaim her lost authority. Her cruelty was born of a deep, festering wound. Understanding this didn't excuse her actions, but it made her predictable. And a predictable enemy is a vulnerable one. The general now had a clear psychological profile of his adversary. The campaign was about to enter a new phase. Having failed to break my will with petty vandalism, Carol opened a new front in her campaign's psychological warfare. Her objective was to turn the entire Whisperwind Lake community against me, to isolate me so completely that I would be forced to sell and flee. Her weapon of choice was the community email list, a simple digital forum for sharing news about potlucks and lost dogs, which she transformed into a platform for slander and fear-mongering. The catalyst, as I had grimly predicted, was her son. A few days after the garden incident, I was sitting on my dock, trying to find some semblance of my lost peace. I saw Kevin, Carol's son, wandering along the shoreline near the edge of my property. He was throwing rocks into the water, getting dangerously close to a slippery, moss-covered outcrop. He was alone. My first instinct, the instinct of any decent human being, was concern. I simply stood up and watched him, my hands in my pockets, ready to shout a warning or run to help if he slipped. I didn't say a word. I just observed, ensuring the boy's safety. After a few minutes, he noticed me watching, looked startled, and scrambled back up the path toward his own cottage. I thought nothing more of it. That evening, an email from the Whisperwind Lake POA landed in my inbox, sent to the entire community mailing list. The subject line read, "Important Community Safety Alert." My blood ran cold as I read it. Dear neighbors, it is with a heavy heart that I must write to you all today about a matter of serious concern. As many of you know, we have a new resident at the old Miller cabin, a Mr. Arthur Vance. While we all wish to be welcoming, a recent incident has forced me to issue this warning, especially to those of you with children. Today, my son Kevin was playing near the shoreline when he was confronted by Mr. Vance. According to my son, Mr. Vance just stood on his dock, staring at him silently for a very long time. This behavior was deeply unsettling and frightening for a young boy. Kevin came home visibly shaken. Given Mr. Vance's reclusive nature and his open hostility towards our community's standards and bylaws, I feel it is my duty as president of our association to advise you all to be cautious. Please instruct your children not to approach his property and to report any unusual behavior immediately. We value safety and peace of mind above all else here at Whisperwind Lake. Sincerely, Carol Brewster. It was a masterpiece of innuendo and character assassination. She had twisted a moment of quiet concern into something menacing and predatory. She painted me as a creepy, hostile recluse, a potential danger to children. In a small, tight-knit community like this, that kind of accusation was radioactive. It was a social death sentence. The fallout was immediate. The next day, when I took my small boat out to fish in the middle of the lake, I saw other residents out on their docks or in their boats. When they saw me, they would turn their backs. Parents who were playing with their children near the water would quickly call them back indoors. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, all of them filled with suspicion and fear. The silence of the lake was no longer peaceful. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of ostracism. A few days later, I had to make a trip to the small general store that served the lake community to pick up some essentials. As I walked down the aisle, a woman with 2 young children saw me, gasped, and physically pulled her kids behind her, shielding them as if I were a wild animal. The store owner, a man who had been perfectly friendly on my previous visits, was now cold and distant. He barely made eye contact as he rang up my groceries. The air was thick with a poison she had so skillfully administered. The isolation was more damaging than any fine or act of vandalism. It was a constant, grinding assault on my spirit. This cabin was supposed to be my refuge, a place to heal from the psychological wounds of a lifetime of conflict. Instead, it had become a new kind of prison, a transparent box where I was the subject of fearful scrutiny. The loneliness was profound. I found myself talking to Sarah on the phone for hours, just to hear a friendly voice, to feel a connection to a world that didn't see me as a monster. "This is defamation. Art," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "It's slander. You could sue her." "And what would that accomplish?" I said, weariness seeping into my bones. "It would drag on for months, cost a fortune, and just entrench everyone's opinions. It would be my word against her frightened little boys. I'd lose. In the court of public opinion, I'd lose before it even started." Instead of a lawyer, I turned to my own training. I began to actively conduct counter-surveillance. I needed to understand the human terrain of the community. I spent time observing the other residents from a distance, using a pair of powerful binoculars. I noted who was friendly with Carol, who seemed to be her loyal lieutenants. I noted who seemed uncomfortable, who avoided her. I was mapping the social network of my own neighborhood, identifying potential allies and hostiles. It was a sick perversion of the skills I had once used to map insurgent networks in hostile territories. During one of these observation sessions, I witnessed a telling interaction. I saw Carol talking to Gary Peterson, the other voting member of her board. She was gesturing angrily toward my cabin, her body language aggressive and commanding. He was nodding along, but his posture was submissive, his eyes constantly darting around as if he were afraid of being seen disagreeing with her. He wasn't her ally. He was her subject. The most painful part of the isolation was the loss of the lake itself. It was no longer a source of solace. It was a stage. Every time I stepped onto my dock, I felt like an actor in a play I hadn't auditioned for, my every move being judged by a hostile audience. She had poisoned the water, poisoned the woods, poisoned the very silence I had come here to find. I added a copy of her email and a detailed log of the community's reactions to my Operation Whisperwind file. The file was growing thick. It was no longer just a collection of grievances. It was a dossier. It was a targeting package. I still didn't know what the final engagement would look like, but I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as steel, that I was no longer on the defensive. I was simply choosing the time and place for my counterattack. The general was patient. He would wait for the enemy to overextend herself, to make a fatal mistake. And I had a feeling that Carol Brewster, drunk on her own power and righteousness, would do just that. Having successfully poisoned the community well, Carol's next move was to leverage that manufactured fear and suspicion to weaponize official authorities. It was a predictable escalation. When her own power as the POA president and the social pressure she'd orchestrated failed to drive me out, she turned to entities with real, state-sanctioned power. Her goal was to create a legitimate, official record of me as a problem, a nuisance, a criminal. The first visit was from the state game warden. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, his green truck pulling quietly down my lane. He was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and a calm, professional demeanor. I met him on the porch, offering him a glass of iced tea, which he politely declined. "Mr. Arthur Vance?" he asked, though he clearly knew who I was. "That's me," I said. "What can I do for you, Warden?" "Got an anonymous call, sir. A complaint. Said you were fishing with an illegal gill net off your dock, and that you were taking well over the legal limit for bass." He had the decency to look slightly embarrassed as he said it. I felt a surge of weary anger, but I pushed it down, replacing it with a practiced, disarming calm. An anonymous call. You say well. Whoever it was has better eyes than me. I haven't had a bite all week. I gestured to my single fishing rod, leaning against the porch rail. That's all the gear I own. Warden, you're welcome to search my cabin, my boat, anywhere you'd like. I've got nothing to hide. My fishing license is tacked to the board just inside the door, right next to the calendar. He looked at me, his gaze steady and assessing. He was a man used to reading people, to sorting liars from honest men. "That won't be necessary, sir. I can see the rod and reel you're using as standard tackle. Just have to follow up on the complaint. You understand." "I understand completely," I said. "You have a job to do. But if you get another anonymous tip about me, you might want to consider the source. There's a property dispute going on with the head of the POA, Mrs. Brewster. She seems to enjoy making official complaints." The warden's expression didn't change, but a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. "I've had interactions with Mrs. Brewster before," he said carefully. "She has a lot of opinions about how things should be run around this lake." He tipped his hat. "Sorry to have bothered you. Mr. Vance, enjoy your day." As he drove away, I felt a small victory. I had handled it correctly. I hadn't been defensive or angry. I had been cooperative, respectful, and had subtly planted the seed that the complaints were malicious. It was a small win, but it was something. I documented the entire exchange in my log, noting the warden's name and badge number. The second visit, a week later, was more serious. This time, it was a county sheriff's deputy. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a military-style haircut and a cautious posture. He didn't come to the door. He stood at the edge of my driveway, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. "Sir, I need you to step out where I can see you," he called out. I stepped off the porch and into the open, my hands held loosely at my sides, away from my body. I knew the protocol. "I'm Arthur Vance. Is there a problem?" "Deputy." "We received a 911 call, sir. A report of a man matching your description, seen carrying a rifle through the woods, trespassing on private property. The caller said you appeared unstable." My heart pounded in my chest. This was a dangerous escalation. A man with a gun call was one of the most volatile situations a cop could walk into. She was actively trying to create a scenario that could get me hurt, or worse. "Deputy," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. "I own a hunting rifle. Yes. It is legally registered. It is currently locked in a gun safe inside my cabin, where it has been since I arrived this summer. I have not taken it out. I have not been trespassing. You have my permission to enter my home and verify that the weapon is secured." The young deputy assessed me, his eyes flicking from my face to my hands, to the surrounding woods. He was on high alert, and I didn't blame him. "Stay right there, sir," he said, speaking into the radio on his shoulder. "Subject is compliant. I'm going to make an approach." He walked towards me slowly, cautiously. "Do you have any weapons on your person, sir?" "No, I do not." "Mind if I check?" "Not at all." He gave me a quick, professional pat-down. As his hands checked my back, I noticed he paused slightly. My back is a latticework of old scars, souvenirs from a long-ago IED. He stepped back, a new expression on his face, a hint of respect, of recognition. "You served?" he asked, his tone shifting from confrontational to conversational. "A long time ago," I said simply. "Army," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Me too. 101st Airborne. Did a tour in Afghanistan." "Stay safe out here, son," I said, my voice softer than before. He nodded, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders. "Look, sir. Mr. Vance." The call came from a Mrs. Brewster. She calls 911 a lot. About everything. We have to respond. But we also have a file on her for misuse of emergency services. This report you're making now, your cooperation, it all goes in that file. "I appreciate that, Deputy," I said. "Thank you for your professionalism." "No problem, sir. You have a good day." He left, and I stood in my driveway for a long time, the adrenaline slowly seeping out of my system. She had crossed a critical line. She had not only lied to law enforcement, but she had created a situation that could have had a tragic outcome. The thought of what could have happened, a misunderstanding, a stray movement, a tragic mistake sent a chill down my spine. That night, I made a call. It was to a number I hadn't dialed in years, a personal cell phone that didn't officially exist. It was answered on the first ring. "Art, what's wrong?" It was Senator Thompson. Years ago, He had been a young captain on my staff. Now, he was one of the most powerful men in Washington. We had saved each other's lives on more than one occasion. "John," I said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I need you to initiate a contingency. A civilian matter has escalated." I explained the situation in cold, factual terms: the systematic harassment, the slander, the malicious and dangerous 911 calls. She's unstable, and I'm concerned her next move will be even more reckless. I need to create a formal, procedural backstop. "Art, this is unacceptable," he said, his voice hard with anger. "Let me make a call to the state AG's office." "That's exactly what I need you to do, John," I interrupted. "But by the book. No special favors. I want your office to formally liaise with the state attorney general. I want you to send them my service record and a summary of this harassment campaign. I want them to open a file and issue a formal advisory to the county sheriff's department, flagging my residence as the target of a pattern of malicious harassment. I want a paper trail, John. A thick one. The next time she calls them. I want an alert to pop up on their screen before they even get here." He was silent for a moment. "I understand," he said, his voice now all business. "You're not asking me to stop her. You're asking me to build the cage, and you're letting her walk into it herself. All right. Art, consider it done. My chief of staff will liaise with the AG's office first thing in the morning. The advisory will be in the system within 48 hours. But listen to me. If this gets any worse, you call me. That's an order." "Thank you, John," I said, a wave of grim relief washing over me. I hung up the phone. The trap was now being set, not by me, but by the very system Carol thought she could manipulate. She was playing checkers. I had just put the full weight of the U.S. Senate and a state attorney general's office on my side of the chessboard. The final escalation, the one that pushed the entire conflict into its endgame, was a direct and personal threat to the one thing I had left my sanctuary. Having failed to drive me out with social pressure, and having only succeeded in building a case against herself by weaponizing the authorities, Carol made a final, desperate move. She decided to threaten the very existence of my cabin. It happened on a gray, overcast Saturday. The air was heavy with the promise of a storm. I was down on my dock, repairing a loose board, when I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. It was Carol. She was alone this time, and she was holding a thick manila envelope. Her face was set in a grim, determined mask. But I could see a flicker of something else in her eyes, a manic, triumphant gleam. She believed she was coming to deliver the killing blow. She didn't stop at the edge of the property this time. She marched right down onto my dock, stopping a few feet from me. The wooden planks groaned under her feet. "Vance," she said, dispensing with any pretense of civility, "we need to talk." I slowly straightened up, my back aching. I placed the hammer on a piling, keeping it within reach. I said nothing. I just looked at her, my face as impassive as I could make it. My silence seemed to unnerve her more than any angry retort would have. "I have tried to be reasonable with you," she began, a statement so divorced from reality that it was almost comical. "I have tried to get you to understand that you are not welcome here. You have ignored the warnings. You have defied the bylaws. You have thumbed your nose at this entire community." "I've kept to myself and bothered no one," I said, my voice low and even. "You are the one who has harassed, slandered, and endangered me." "You brought this on yourself," she shrieked, her composure finally cracking. "With your secrecy and your arrogance. But it's over. I'm going to save this lake from you, once and for all." She brandished the envelope like a dagger. "Do you know what this is? This is a copy of a petition I have filed with the County Zoning and Planning Board. It cites your property as a dilapidated structure, a public nuisance, and a violation of newly passed shoreline management ordinances. Ordinances I personally lobbied the board to pass." My blood turned to ice. She had gone around the POA, around the grandfather clause, and had gone straight for the county government, manipulating the levers of local bureaucracy. "The board is holding a hearing next month," she continued, her voice ringing with vindictive glee. "They will vote to have your property condemned. They will seize it under eminent domain for the public good, to turn this blighted piece of land into a community park. I have the votes. Vance, my husband, sits on the board. Gary Peterson's brother-in-law is the chairman. You're finished. In 6 months, there will be nothing left of this hovel but a picnic table and a nice, compliant, beige boat launch." She was threatening to take my home, to bulldoze my refuge, and turn it into a park for the very community that had ostracized me at her command. It was the most cruel, most complete form of destruction she could imagine, to erase me and my home from the landscape entirely. I stared at her, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. The part of me that had been holding back, the part that still clung to the hope of a peaceful resolution, died. The calm I had been projecting was no longer an act of de-escalation. It was the chilling calm of a predator that has finally identified its moment to strike. My entire career had been about dealing with threats to security, to sovereignty, to lives. And she had just made a direct, existential threat against the one small piece of sovereignty I had left in the world. My training took over. My vision narrowed slightly, focusing on her, assessing her as a threat. I noted her stance, the tension in her shoulders, the rapid, shallow breathing. She was high on her own power, making her reckless. "You've made a grave miscalculation, Carol," I said, my voice dropping to a register she had never heard before. It was not the voice of Arthur Vance, the quiet retiree. It was the voice of a commander in the field. She was taken aback by the change in my demeanor, but she recovered quickly. "Is that a threat? Are you threatening me? I'll have you arrested for that." "It is not a threat," I said, taking a slow step toward her. "It is a statement of fact. You have just declared war on a man you know nothing about. You have escalated this from a petty squabble into something else entirely, and you are not prepared for the consequences." A flicker of doubt, of fear, finally appeared in her eyes. She had expected me to beg, to argue, to be broken. She was not prepared for this cold, unwavering certainty. "You're just a sad old man in a broken-down shack," she spat, her voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. "You have nothing." "You're wrong," I said softly. I took out my wallet, and from a hidden sleeve, I removed a small, heavy, bronze coin. I held it in my palm. It was my challenge coin, bearing the insignia of my last command. I didn't show it to her. I just held it, the weight of it grounding me. "You are going to fail. Your petition will be thrown out. Your allies on the board will abandon you. And you will face legal and financial ruin for what you have done. I promise you that." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she was not in control, that she had waded into waters far deeper and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "Get off my property," I said, My voice was quiet, but it carried the unshakable weight of a command that had never been disobeyed. She flinched, as if struck. She took a stumbling step backward, then another. She turned and practically fled up the path, the manila envelope still clutched in her hand. I stood on the dock for a long time, the hammer in one hand, the coin in the other. The storm was about to break, both in the sky and in my life. She had made her final move. Now, it was my turn. I walked back to my cabin, my stride purposeful. There was no more waiting. There was no more documenting. It was time to activate the contingency. It was time to end this. The final act began, as I knew it would, with a hysterical 911 call. Carol, unnerved by our confrontation and desperate to reassert her dominance, fell back on her favorite tactic, weaponizing the police. But this time, she went all in. My conversation with Senator Thompson's legal counsel had prepared me for this. We had anticipated that her final move would be to create a public, high-stakes confrontation where she could play the victim and I would be cast as the villain. I was ready for it. It was the following afternoon, a clear and sunny Sunday. I was deliberately making myself visible, splitting firewood in my front yard. I wanted her to see me. I wanted to be the bait in my own trap. At around 3 p.m., I saw her son, Kevin, ride his bike slowly past my property on the lane. He stopped, stared at me for a moment, and then pedaled away furiously. That was the signal. 20 minutes later, the wail of a siren echoed across the lake. A single sheriff's patrol car came speeding down the community lane, kicking up a cloud of dust. It screeched to a halt at the end of my path, blocking any exit, and, right on cue, Carol Brewster came power-walking from her house, her phone to her ear, performing for the audience of neighbors who were now emerging onto their porches, drawn by the commotion. "Yes, he's still there," she cried into the phone, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of terror. "He's got an axe. My son just saw him. He was staring at him, just like before. I'm so scared. Please hurry." A deputy emerged from the patrol car. It was the same young man I had met before, the Army veteran. His name tag read Miller. This time, his hand was not resting on his sidearm. It was unsnapped, ready. He had been dispatched to a man with an axe, acting erratically call. His posture was tense, his expression grim. "Sir, step away from the axe and put your hands up," he commanded, his voice amplified by the tension of the situation. I immediately complied. I set the axe down gently on the chopping block and raised my hands slowly to shoulder height. "It's all right, Deputy Miller," I said, my voice calm and clear. "It's Arthur Vance. We've met." Carol had now arrived at the scene, positioning herself near the deputy. "He's dangerous. Officer," she yelled. "He threatened me yesterday. He's mentally unstable. You have to arrest him. He's a danger to our children." Deputy Miller ignored her, his focus entirely on me. "Sir, I need you to walk towards me, slowly." I did as he asked, taking slow, deliberate steps. I stopped about 15 feet from him. The entire neighborhood was watching. This was Carol's moment of ultimate triumph. She was about to see me handcuffed and taken away, humiliated and defeated in front of everyone. Her face was flushed with victory. "What's going on here, Mr. Vance?" Miller asked, his eyes scanning me for any sign of aggression. "Mrs. Brewster is filing another false report. Deputy," I said calmly. "I was splitting firewood on my own property. Her son rode by. That is the full extent of what has happened here. "He's lying!" Carol shrieked. "He's a menace! I want him arrested!" It was time. I looked directly at Deputy Miller. "Deputy, before this proceeds any further," I said, my voice steady and firm, "I need you to run my name, Arthur Vance, and this address. There should be a specific advisory notice attached, filed by the State Attorney General's office." Deputy Miller looked skeptical, but something in my tone made him hesitate. It was a procedural request, not a panicked denial. It was the voice of a man who knew the system. "Stay right where you are," he ordered, and backed away to his patrol car. He spoke into his radio, then turned to the computer terminal inside. Carol saw this as a victory. "That's right. Officer, check his record. I bet he's a criminal." I could see Deputy Miller's back stiffen as he read the screen. He was motionless for a long moment. When he turned back around and got out of the car, his entire demeanor had transformed. The aggressive, confrontational posture was gone, replaced by a rigid formality. He walked not toward me, but toward Carol. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," he said, his voice now cold and official. He turned to me. "Mr. Vance, sir, apologies. An advisory has just come up on my screen. I've been instructed to de-escalate this situation and contact my supervisor and a state police liaison immediately." Carol stared, her mouth agape, the color beginning to drain from her face. What advisory? He's the one with the axe." "Ma'am," Miller said, turning his full attention to her, his voice hard as iron. "The advisory states that you have engaged in a documented pattern of malicious harassment and have filed multiple false reports against the resident of this address. It also states that a temporary restraining order against you was filed by Mr. Vance this morning. By coming here, and by making this 911 call, you are in direct violation of a court order." He wasn't finished. "What the advisory doesn't say, but what a man like me can figure out, is who you've been doing this to." He took a half step towards her, lowering his voice. "This nobody, as you call him, is Major General Arthur Vance, retired. You haven't been fighting with a grumpy old man, ma'am. You've been criminally harassing one of this country's most decorated soldiers." A collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Carol's face, which had been flushed with victory, turned a ghastly, mottled white. Her jaw went slack. Her eyes were wide with a horror that was just beginning to dawn. Miller pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 15. The situation is secure. The 911 call from complainant Carol Brewster has been identified as false and malicious, and is a violation of a standing TRO. I am placing Mrs. Brewster under arrest. Please send a second unit." He then looked at me, and in a gesture that was not for the crowd, but was a quiet, personal message from one veteran to another, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod of profound respect. The world seemed to stop. Carol let out a small, strangled gasp, a sound like a dying animal. Her carefully constructed kingdom, her power, her reputation, it all evaporated in a single, humiliating instant. She had tried to swat a fly and had ended up punching a hornet's nest. No, not a hornet's nest. She had tried to bully a quiet old man and had found herself standing before a giant. Her reign was over. The aftermath was as swift and decisive as the climax. With Deputy Miller's supervisor on the scene and my formal statement given, Carol Brewster was taken into custody. The public nature of her downfall was absolute. The entire community had witnessed her unmasking. The charges were serious repeated misuse of the 911 system, filing false police reports, And once the legal brief from Senator Thompson's office was forwarded to the district attorney, a charge under a state statute that made severe harassment of a veteran an elevated offense. Faced with my meticulous log, the testimony of the game warden and Deputy Miller, and the saved image from my trail camera, Carol's case was indefensible. Her husband, implicated in the zoning board conspiracy, was forced to resign from his position in disgrace. They sold their house at a loss to pay her legal fees, and the substantial civil settlement they were ordered to pay me for defamation and emotional distress. Carol was sentenced to 2 years of probation, a hefty fine, and 500 hours of community service, which she was forced to serve at a local VA hospital. Her reign over Whisperwind Lake was over, ending not with a bang, but with the quiet shame of a public record. The Whisperwind Lake Property Owners Association imploded. In the wake of the scandal, the other residents, finally free from Carol's tyranny, called an emergency meeting. They voted to dissolve the old board and rewrite the bylaws, stripping them of their most draconian and subjective rules. A new, more reasonable board was elected, and their first official act was to send me a formal, written apology on behalf of the entire community, along with a statement affirming my property's exempt status for all time. The change in the community was palpable. My neighbors, who had once shunned me, now treated me with a quiet, profound respect. They kept their distance, not out of fear, but out of a deep understanding of my need for privacy. They would offer a simple, friendly wave from their boats, or a nod at the general store. The suspicion was replaced by admiration, and my solitude was no longer an act of isolation, but a privilege they all seemed committed to protecting. One cool autumn evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset paint the lake in strokes of orange and purple. The silence had returned, but it was a different kind now. It was deeper, richer, and untainted by anxiety. It was the true, healing silence I had been searching for. My past was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a part of my story that had, ironically, secured my peaceful future. A canoe, painted a familiar, rich forest green, was resting by the dock. The beige paint had been the first thing to go. I had spent a week carefully stripping it away and restoring the canoe to its former glory. It was a small act of defiance, a reclamation of my identity. I was not beige. I was not harmonious. I was myself. My phone rang. It was Sarah. "How is it up there, General?" she asked, a playful teasing in her voice. "It's quiet, Sarah," I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "It's finally quiet." The war for Whisperwind Lake was over. Peace had been declared.